Okay, hi, this is part 4 of the Internal Context of Bilingual Processing series, and today I'm going to be talking about the architecture. It should take about 17 minutes, and it will be fairly abstract, so I recommend that you check it out several times before moving on to the next one. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Let's now look at the overview. First, I'm going to be talking about the inner and the outer mind, then about what I call basic communication and language, and making a distinction between the two. Language being something that humans possess, basic communication being something that all animals possess to a greater degree or lesser degree of sophistication, and which we often call language in an informal way. Then I shall move on to context, a crucial concept of course in this series, and end up with a quick picture of what I mean by linguistic processing and internal context. Let's begin with the distinction between the inner and the outer mind. Remember that I'm not talking about the physical brain, I'm talking about the system behind it. Okay, and when I say the system, I'm not talking about the physical system, the neurons and various cells and pathways. I'm talking about the basic abstract organization behind the brain, in the same way that I would describe the London Underground system by referring to the map, the iconic map you find in every London Underground station, and not talking about the details of the electrical system and the carriages and the tunnels and all that sort of thing. So I'm talking about the system, and this system is what we call the mind, but it's still a biological concept. Perhaps you think about the mind in more or less psychological terms, but it is something that we possess as biological beings, so it is a biological system in a way, and I'm going to continue to think about it in this way. And in the modular cognition framework, we think of it in terms of inner and outer layers. So the outer layer, the outer mind, consists of the various ways which we represent the sensory signals that come in and which we use to create representations. So what comes in through the eyes are basically physical sensations on the back of the retina, and these patterns we translate and create into representations. This is where cognition begins, and in visual terms, and so on and so forth for the other four systems. So this outer ring of cognitive systems, the one that is nearest, as it were, to what we conceive of as the outside world, is our perceptual portal to the outside world, but it is also a portal facing inwards to the mind's inner systems. So we have a set of systems which are part of the outer layer of the mind, and now we're going to look at what's inside. But first, let's just review what we have. We've got 5 different types of representation, each created by an independent system, and these are intimately connected, as I've described before. And it so happens that along with all the other visual representations we create, there are some which do have a function as language, although the visual system does not know this and makes no distinction between, let's say, the pattern made by a letter of the alphabet or a pattern made by a cat. In the same way, the auditory system has a whole lot of representations of different sounds that we've experienced, and we represent these in various ways. Some of these representations happen to be connected with language, although the auditory system doesn't know this. It only becomes language later, as we'll see. Okay. And so the fact is that if we just had this kind of cognition, the outer layer type of cognition, we would be pretty lost, because we wouldn't be able to make sense of the space around us, navigate through space. We would not be able to evaluate anything as good or bad. It would have no emotional significance to us, and most of all, nothing would have any meaning. And to have all this dimension, we require the cognitive systems that constitute what I call our inner mind, right? So the inner mind is a way of interpreting, making sense of, evaluating the various representations we have stored, created in our outer ring of systems in the perceptual portal. Okay, and the inner mind in the modular cognition framework consists of 4 new additional cognitive systems. I'm actually only going to deal with these 2. These are the most important ones for our purposes here in this series. But the motor system, of course, is important for language, because we needed to be able to articulate, to organize the way we move our vocal cords and our hands and our face to make facial expressions. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to be focusing on these 2. Potentially, perhaps the conceptual system most of all. So these are the 4 systems in the inner mind, and I've just included a couple of the systems from the outside portal, the visual system and the auditory system, because these are the most important ones for language. Now moving on to the second point, which is the distinction between basic communication, which we all have, and which animals have as well, and to a greater or lesser degree. To take basic communication first, imagine that you find yourself in a country where no one understands the language that you're speaking, and you have certainly no idea of the language that they are speaking. You are still able to survive remarkably well using your basic communication skills. And to do this, you need these 4 systems in particular, right? So the visual system and the auditory system, either one or the other or both, and you need a way of attributing meaning to various signs, for example, and you need a conceptual system to make sense of various sounds, and you need an affective system to evaluate the importance of some things over others. So all these things together, very, very briefly, might be able to be called language in an informal sense. And earlier on, I talked in the previous series in particular, I talked about Kanzi, the bonobo, and other animals who are able to attribute meaning to certain sounds, and particular certain visual symbols, and they each one having a single meaning, and they're able to string these together into an approximation of what we might understand as language. But at the same time, it's a real quantum leap between this kind of system and the sophisticated system that human beings use. So I'm not going to call this language as such. human language certainly needs systems that I've just mentioned, but it needs something extra, and it needs a linguistic system, or as we say in the modular cognition framework, linguistic systems. There are two of them, right? There's the syntactic system, which creates linguistic structure that we call syntax for deciding the way that words can combine, or parts of words can combine in different ways, and we have a phonological system which uses representations taken from the auditory system and creates a particular kind of structure that we call speech structure, or it can be used in sign language to create a sign language structure. So whether you want to talk about this as one or two systems, this is very briefly what people usually refer to as grammar. Okay, and that's for language in the human sense. We need all of the above, as it were, plus these two, which are not possessed by any other species, by definition. And the nice thing about these grammars is that they can be created for any language. This system is a system which enables you to construct linguistic structure appropriate to any particular language that you are exposed to. And children do this miraculously around about the age of 3. They create sophisticated grammar based on the experience that they have of what has been signed, spoken around them. They can do that without having any needing any education to do that, without having to understand what language is. It's just instinctive. It happens, and it happens because we have been given, as part of our biological inheritance, a system or systems for doing so. And another things we can say about this is that one individual using this human linguistic system or systems can create grammars of different languages. So in the same head, in the same individual head, or I should say in the same individual mind, you can have alongside each other more than one language. 2, 3, 4, 5 languages can exist. The only difference being, of course, that there will be different connections within and outside, stretching outside the system. So, but you won't have to create a new cognitive system for each language. This one set of systems can cope with that, no problem. It is, of course, a problem in the sense that each new language will compete with a language that's already there. So you will have to resolve the conflict and competition between these 2 or 3 or 4. So I wouldn't say no problem in general, but we do have the ability to learn more than one language using this set of linguistic systems. So, turning now to context. Now, of course, the thing is about context is that it remains true that we can never really directly know the outside world. We know it only indirectly through the world that we create inside us. Right? And this is quite a difficult concept for us to grasp, but nevertheless it's true. The outside world only really exists for us inside our minds. And psychologists often use the example of colours to dramatically illustrate this point. There are outside no colours. So you might say, well, I can look through the window and I can see a tree, I know it's a tree and it's there outside and it's green. So how do you mean there's no green outside? But the fact remains is that the green is created in your head. So all the colours of the world outside and much else besides are created in your head. So someone says, which apples does she eat? To make sense of that, you have to know the context. And you might say, well, the context consists of the apples that exist in the outside world. I can see a couple over there. And eating, certainly, I see people eating. I know what is eating. It's all out there. But now we know that it's all actually in your head. So all the context, really, that we talk about when we talk about understanding a particular thing like which apples does she eat, is all, it depends on the representations you create in the various cognitive systems that you have in your mind. So context is an internal creation, no matter whether it refers to the external world or not. And more specifically, it's a contribution of both the outer mind, which supplies the cognitive systems that we talked about at the beginning, the perceptual representations of the outside world, of what we think about as the outside world, and the way we interpret them using the cognitive systems in our inner mind, creating value and meaning and that sort of thing. And finally, we end up with the internal context of linguistic processing, and now you know what I mean by linguistic processing in this very specific sense, and you know that by linguistic I also include bilingual, multilingual as well as monolingual processing. What is this then? So the context that we create internally using the various cognitive systems we have at our disposal in our biological mind are done using the human linguistic system that we have inside us, and linking up these abstract linguistic representations which are crucial for understanding and producing language with the internal context of the time supplied by whatever currently is being activated in our visual system, in our conceptual system, creating the meanings, the affective system, creating the values and the emotions, and the auditory system, creating the sound representations at any particular moment, such as when someone says to us, which apples does she eat? So that brings us to the end of this. I see we've got to 18 minutes now, so it's relatively long by my standards, and I shall try to be a little more concrete next time by giving you some particular examples. I can't promise you everything that is in the book, which has the same title as this series, but at least it will give, this is only meant to be a taster, but it will give you a better idea of how what I've talked about today can be applied. So I hope that you will come back and look at the 5th presentation whenever it's ready. Goodbye.